In this part of the competition, you are taking on a fictional business identity and assigning a fictional business identity to us as the judges. Please make sure everyone knows who you are and who they are before you begin. You will have 25 minutes to describe the legal, financial, and ethical dimensions of the problem and to recommend a solution that passes muster on all three counts. During this time, teams will be uninterrupted. When you are finished, the judges will ask you questions for 10 to 15 minutes. During the Q&A, both you and the judges stay in character. After the Q&A, the judges will give you feedback outside of the role play. So, with that said, we should let the judges introduce themselves.
Go ahead, Hal.
Yes, I'm retired, and I've had executive experience in accounting investigations, in fraud prevention, and in public relations advisory on management policies through my career. And I was the public relations manager for Coldwell Banker and Company when they were public, which is a large real estate company in the United States. Second, after that, I was the corporate public relations director worldwide for Petrolane Incorporated, which was a large company that was in oil and gas production and distribution. And I worked with De Anza Corporation in financial advisory and financial public relations when they went public as a public corporation. And in my most recent years, I've been a management consultant in fraud prevention and forensic accounting, and I'm a certified fraud examiner.
Very good. Hi, my name is Roberto Castaneda. I have kind of two things I've done in my career: logistics, which I think it will be appropriate for this conversation, and compliance, trade compliance, in terms of making sure that our shipments are legal across the international borders. I've been doing that for 20 or 25 years, and one of the names you might recognize that I've worked for is Dell in Austin, and it's definitely nice to be here, and I appreciate you coming in and presenting, and I look forward to hearing more about your presentation.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you, Roberto. And I'm that Joe O'Hannigan guy. I've got about 20 years of various management roles, some of that in global supply chain and local supply chain logistics, some of that in global manufacturing and continuous improvement of operations, and about 10 years in academia sprinkled throughout. Enough about us. It is really all about you as a team today. So you've heard a little of intro from us, and now it's all yours.
Thank you. It's so nice to meet all of you. I think Stephen will go ahead and share his screen, and we'll get started with some introductions.
Awesome. So today we're going to be taking on the role of external consultants and talking with Amazon. Specifically, our audience will be Dave Clark, CEO of the Worldwide Consumer, and Kara Hurst, Vice President of Worldwide Sustainability. And our presentation begins now. Thank you all for having us today, and welcome to our presentation. We appreciate your time so very much. We do have a lot to cover today, so without further ado, we'll be diving into the meat and potatoes of some of the issues that we see currently with Amazon sustainability and their supply chain, and some of the things we think y'all should do to address those. To first introduce ourselves, I'm Stephen Gooch. I'm joined today by my teammates Laura Key and Mia Barone. And one of the frameworks that we'll be using in order to critically investigate some of those issues we've identified within the supply chain are going to be those goals outlined by the United Nations in their strategic development goals. Specifically, goal number 14 is one that we really honed in on, and that is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development.
Great, thanks, Stephen. So to contextualize our further discussion of Amazon and its sustainability initiative, We'll start with a very broad look at the supply chain, which I'm sure you're familiar with already. For this case, we've divided it into two areas, and these really hinge on the fulfillment center. So the first section of the supply chain is inbound to the fulfillment center. It starts with the products as they're manufactured at the factory. From there, they're carried by ocean freight on a container ship to the fulfillment center. The second half is outbound logistics, which is what we're all familiar with and what the consumer is most familiar with when they think of Amazon. So this consists of fulfillment center selections, shipping, and then delivery to the final destination, whether that's a consumer's home or a business. So in thinking about Amazon's sustainability commitment, they're really a leader in this area. You've been making big actions already to address conservation and the impact that the company has on the environment. And the sustainability actions have been clearly taken across a variety of areas of your business operations. So to really understand what Amazon is doing with sustainability, we took a look at their most recent sustainability report, which was released in June 2020. In this report, we found a goal that really intrigued us, and it's your goal of shipment zero by 2030. And in the report, it explains that this is the goal of making all Amazon shipments net zero carbon and reaching this goal 50% by 2030. So moving to the next slide, we wanted to take a closer look at what this goal includes. And by definition in the sustainability report, it only consists of the part of the logistics chain from the fulfillment center to the final destination. So returning to this idea of the Amazon supply chain, we have great accountability in terms of the goal of shipment zero for the outbound logistics piece, but we need transparency for the inbound logistics and an implementation of sustainability initiatives here. So how can we build best practices into that goal at the front end of the supply chain? Laura will take over and explain a little bit about what shipment zero might look like with inbound transportation.
Thanks, Mia. That was a great introduction. So with shipment zero, we identified the outbound and then inbound logistics pieces and components. On the next slide, we see that we really want to focus and hone in on the inbound logistics component while we're addressing the side of the operations that is in country. Whether it's here in the US, in the UK, in any other country across the world where Amazon operates, we're not necessarily addressing our international shipping challenges. So on the next slide, we'll go ahead and take a look at an example. This specifically addresses transporting goods from Beijing, China to Los Angeles, California. This is a pretty frequent shipping route for them to take, so we thought that it would be appropriate to address it in this way. So for Amazon, when considering in the process of importing materials from other countries, they typically follow the Ex Works Incoterm. This means that they take responsibility, they or one of their subsidiaries takes responsibility for the goods at the facility of the supplier. And we think that this is a unique practice, but it makes sense for your company, given that Amazon purchases such a large quantity of items, and by negotiating their own shipping contracts, that will significantly reduce the cost of transit. So again, as stated, Ex Works indicates that the importer, Amazon will take responsibility for it, but Amazon typically operates on a two-pronged approach. They take responsibility, but operate as a non-vessel operating carrier, meaning they have legal responsibility for the goods, but they're using a third-party logistics company or other courier service to actually transport those goods from point A to point B. In this case, Beijing to Los Angeles. Stephen, can you flip to the next slide and we can take a closer look? Perfect. So again, the supplier has control of the goods for production and then also responsibility for packaging so that it doesn't get damaged in transit. At that point, The materials are physically received by Beijing Joyo Courier Service, which Amazon contracts with in this region of the world. And then Amazon is responsible for all legal aspects, whether that is the bill of lading, the insurance policy, filling out all other necessary customs forms, and those aspects. Once the goods arrive to Amazon's fulfillment center in Los Angeles, that is when Amazon is responsible both for the physical and legal aspects involving the goods. So next, I will pass it off and we will look a little bit further into how we can change what shipping looks like for the better on Amazon's behalf.
Great. So as Laura mentioned, Amazon has a legal responsibility and a responsibility for possession of the goods they ship using Beijing Joyo through Incoterms. But we also think that you have an ethical responsibility for the effect that shipping has with your subsidiary as you move through the oceans. So moving on to the next slide, just a brief overview of how this fits together from the supply chain to the UN sustainability goals to the shipping practices. We know that cargo ships are huge polluters. It's an oft-quoted fact that pollution from one cargo ship equals pollution from 50 million cars. And in fact, 15 cargo ships, pollution from them equals the same amount of pollution as all cars that humans are using on Earth. This is largely because cargo ships burn bunker fuel, which is a heavy fuel oil and a dirty fuel. And we want to address pollution in our solution specifically from this fuel combustion. We talk a lot in the media and in discussions about anthropogenic carbon and global warming. And this is a hugely important issue, but it's not the only issue that these shipping routes raise. This is a different process and one with quite a local impact on the oceans and an effect on the marine life right on those shipping routes, returning to our UN sustainability goal. So how does this all work? When ships burn the heavy fuel oil, the oxides that are released are converted to nitric and sulfuric acid in the air. And these have a very local residency in the oceans. You can see them along the shipping routes. Moving to the next slide. Perfect. So these acidic aerosols are deposited as the ships move within just tens or hundreds of miles from the source. And in this diagram from geophysical research letters, we can actually see the localized effect along major shipping routes. The effect in the ocean pH is that it lowers, and the seasonal acidification here and the impact of that pH drop on oceans is actually on the same order as annual acidification from carbon dioxide. So thinking about a very sensitive and complex marine environment, the impact and the seasonality of this change can really not be overstated. So moving on to the next slide, we wanted to take a look at the fuel mix that vessel types are currently using. Amazon primarily uses container ships, which you can see in the first row on this slide. And taking a look back at projections from past years and the way that the fuel mix is moving in the future, bunker fuel is making up a smaller and smaller proportion of the merchant fleet's power, but it's still a sizable one. Amazon has, you've invested in Infinium, which is a sustainable fuel, and I think that Amazon will ultimately make the shift there in terms of their fuel mix for their ships. But right now, heavy fuel oil is still a major proportion of the bunker fuel mix. And even through 2030, it's important to have a solution that will allow you to not completely get rid of this bunker fuel, but use it in a more sustainable way for our oceans. So returning to the idea of the ripple effect and thinking about the UN goal of sustainably using the oceans, we wanted to outline for you a few of the direct impacts of shipping emissions. The first is that the reduced calcification that's possible by marine organisms in an acidified ocean. The extra hydrogen in this low pH seawater reacts with calcium carbonate, which essentially means the animals in the ocean can't use it to build their shells. And this is important for the food chain, but also really important when thinking about global warming in our atmosphere, because when these organisms die, they take that carbon dioxide that's in their shells and store it on the ocean floor, removing it from the ocean in our atmosphere. Acidification in the ocean also has a similar effect on coral reefs. It erodes coral and makes it hard for them to form new life. And coral reefs are, of course, important as homes for many animals in marine diversity, but they're also important, of course, on a business level because they're home to many commercially important fish species and essential to our human food supply. The third thing is that sulfur oxides have been proven to have a harmful effect on the health of humans who live in communities surrounding the ocean. Studies have shown that the release of this oxides cause respiratory disease and also cardiovascular disease. Even when it's released in the atmosphere, these oxides can lead to acid rain, which harms humans, but also crops, again, impacting the food supply. So thinking about all of these things and the drastic effects that the burning of heavy fuel oils has on the oceans, we wanted to propose a solution that would allow us to most sustainably use these fuels, not getting rid of them entirely because that's not a reasonable prediction, but making sure that we can lessen our impact on the oceans in which we operate.
And a way that we can do that going into the future and actually practice that as well, understood and in play in today's world, is slow steaming. And so slow steaming has really taken hold of the industry, especially during the economic downturn of 2008, when many companies sought to cut costs through shipping, especially given the rising fuel costs. They implemented slow steaming. In essence, slow steaming is simply running those cargo ships at a slower speed, so typically 12 to 19 knots versus their typical 20 to 24 knots. And the savings that those ships and container lines realize by doing so are quite astounding. Just by bumping down a couple knots, it's amazing the amount of fuel that these cargo ships don't have to burn. And obviously that's going to have a great effect in reducing those negative effects that we just talked about earlier. And so to illustrate this, this is a really useful graphic put together by the research conducted by the Oriental Overseas Container Line, it's OOCL, as you can see. They found that increasing speed by just a couple of knots burns almost 50% more fuel per unit of distance traveled. And so obviously, you can see that this chart takes off exponentially, and those inefficiencies continue to grow as ships try to attain faster shipping times and efficiencies to satisfy their customers. Furthermore, the next chart really shows the diminishing returns of profits for companies. This report was put together through research conducted at the University of Hamburg in Germany and presented at the Hawaii International Conference on shipping system sciences. And so you can see here on this chart that not only do profit, this black line, continue to decrease after about 20 knots of speed, but up until that point, and so of course that's in the range of 12 to 19 knots that is defined as slow shipping, profits do continue to increase for those companies. But after that point of that turning point of about 20 knots, typical container lines will see decreases in profits, as you can tell here by the purple line, that their fuel expenses continue to rise exponentially, and the profits that they realize by having those goods shipped more quickly don't make up for that increase in costs. And so from this, we do glean two major points by, of course, implementing slow steaming. And so this will vary according to the ship and company, anywhere in that 12 to 19 knot range. Companies will be able to lower fuel costs. And Amazon will be able to implement this in its supply chain. And of course, a great benefit of this as well, outside of the company, is to the world around you. And so, of course, in marine life, those reduced emissions, as Mia talked about, can greatly reduce the negative impacts that the shipping industry has on marine life, as well as the world around it, and that those greenhouse gases have on human life as well, and the communities that depend on the ocean for their livelihood. And so now that we've talked a little bit about some of the benefits to be gained by slow steaming in general, what are some of the more specific implications that this has for you as Amazon? Why is it necessarily worth it, and how does it look on the bottom line?
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great point. So our goal here is to present some actionable insights for you as to what this would look like for Amazon to adopt this practice of slow steaming. So moving on to the next slide, slow steaming obviously will be used for ocean voyages, first of all, and typical goods that Amazon carries on these routes are their consumer products. So things such as clothing, toys, books, things of that nature, nothing that is perishable in any way. That would be a completely different set of characteristics that we would be solving for. So this is not their entire supply chain, but just focused on consumer goods that we might be purchasing. So for consumer goods, Amazon has essentially two options in our mind. First of all, they can continue using a courier service as they use from Beijing to Los Angeles. And this has been the typical route they've employed, but in the past 2 years, we have also seen them making a concerted effort to build their own internal supply network, which would allow them to guard a little bit more against risk. So let's take a closer look at using a courier service. Let's stay on the previous slide, please. With the courier service, it's important to keep in mind that Amazon's economies of scale allowed them to negotiate attractive contracts with couriers. Although they aren't filling all of the containers on a ship, they have the ability to say, we would prefer our goods to be slow steamed, and to make that change, we ultimately believe. We don't believe that cost to Amazon will decrease, but there will be intangible benefits, reputational, as well as just knowing that we are not polluting the atmosphere as much. I think that that would be an attractive proposition to any of us, but especially to Amazon, as they ship so many packages and so many items across the globe. We don't foresee the cost decreasing, as the courier service would like to maintain their current margins and will also need additional equipment to do this, but we believe that it will ultimately be a reputational benefit on that end of the spectrum. If they consider doing this to build their internal supply network and taking these operations in-house, they definitely already have the scale to be able to make these infrastructure investments and make these so-called big bets on purchasing boats of their own and things of that nature. Amazon Global Logistics is their effort in this area that started a couple of years ago just to explore what it would look like to have their own logistics practice. And this obviously carries a higher capital investment, but also Amazon is responsible for transporting their own goods. And that is also a value add in our mind, as they have control over timing, scheduling, and also security of the goods that they are transporting. So building upon this, we're going to take a look at what the financial picture would look like for one boat to convert to slow steaming. And this would apply to a courier service model or to Amazon itself. So we're looking at this through the lens of one 8,000 20-foot equivalent unit ship. So this is a ship that can carry 4,000 of the containers that we typically see, which are 40 foot. This is a relatively medium-sized ship, one that we might see them carrying larger ships in their fleet, but this was one that we felt that we could strongly represent with supported calculations. So there's three main one-time costs to converting to slow steaming that we see. The first is a result of increasing the size of their ship fleet. They will need to add additional ships to compensate for the fact that they are spending more days en route, and ultimately will be able to make less trips over the course of each year. So with a 10% reduction in speed, we'd be looking at a 10.9% increase in need for ship availability. And the average ship cost is about $100 million. So therefore, for every ship that we have, we'd project a $10.9 million investment in more ship capacity. The next step would be to convert engines for slow steaming for existing ships. So for this one ship, that would cost around $200,000 to cover the cost of engineers to work on the engines, as well as any materials needed and equipment to accomplish this task and the time that the ship is out of service. Lastly, there will be a slight increased inventory carrying costs for Amazon as their goods will spend more time on the water. This is a cost that Amazon, if they took this internally, may be able to mitigate themselves. So we weren't able to forecast this exactly, but we do think it's important to keep in mind. However, we do believe that shipping smaller amounts of each item within their units and then distributing those across the US more frequently could also solve the issue. Moving on to the saving side of the equation, approximately for a 10% reduction in speed, we'd see a 30% reduction in fuel usage, and the average metric ton of bunker fuel costs around $500. And currently, at current speeds, they use about 225 metric tons per day. With these base numbers in mind, a 30% savings in bunker fuel would look like a saving $33,500 per day. And with the number of days that the ship is at sea and not in port, we estimate that they would save $12 million per year with this initiative. Considering our one-time costs that will incur in year one against the long-term savings that we will realize both in year one and years following, we found that we would see a $925,000 net gain per ship in the first year, and we would continue to see those long-term savings year after year. As mentioned previously, this financial gain is attractive, but we also believe that there's a reputational and ethical angle here, and Stephen is going to share a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Laura. So in evaluating the ethical implications of the situation, a point of view that came to mind immediately for us was a view of utilitarianism. How can the changes that Amazon has the opportunity to implement now have the greatest effect of good on the greatest population of people possible? In using that framework, we took a deeper look at several different elements that are defined under the framework of the triple bottom line, which was established by John Elkington in the early 1970s. He was a British economist, and his views on the issue that and the belief that companies should have a greater focus broader than their own single bottom line of profit, that they should seek to have philanthropic efforts for the people around them and to benefit their environment. This idea has spread like wildfire in recent centuries, and with the progression of the concerned consumer, as we've seen shoppers continually becoming more and more aware of how goods get to their door and caring more about the impact that their consumer behavior has on the environment, firms have started to pay increasingly more attention to the triple bottom line. And Amazon yourselves, you're no exception of the example given here today, because you've set forth many great examples and goals to accomplish by 2030 in your most recent publication. However, we still think that there's a great opportunity to tweak this plan just a little bit and have even greater effect on your triple bottom line. So one, as discussed throughout much of this presentation and most recently by Laura, you have the opportunity to realize great savings in fuel, leading to increases in profit. over the long term here in just a couple short years. Also, by doing this, the reduction in fuel emissions as well as consumption have a positive impact on the people, not only who work in and around your shipping lines, but also who depend on the ocean for their livelihoods. And of course, finally, to note on that, the planet does stand to benefit from these changes due to the decrease in emissions, decrease in ocean acidification, and the negative impact that it has on marine life. And as mentioned before, the people who heavily rely on the ocean for their livelihoods. An additional note to the profit line as well, there's some intangibles that we didn't get to discuss in the more analytical side that I believe should be noted here as well. We do think that if you were to implement and reach further back into and act on this ethical responsibility, we believe that you have as a company to reach back further than just fulfillment centers to cover the entirety of your supply chain. In doing so, not only will you set the standard, as we mentioned, you have economy of scale to kind of demand essentially how your courier services will comply with the slow steaming standard set by you, but also to set the standard in the industry to make it more acceptable for other shipping lines to adopt these more more environmentally friendly practices. And in doing so as well, we believe have a great opportunity to capture on being some of the first to set such a high standard in slow steaming and capturing more of the concerned consumer, as mentioned beforehand. That being said, we believe that overall the answer to the inefficiencies and the ethical responsibility we believe that you have as a company to reach back further and cover the entirety of your supply chain can be summarized and answered quite easily with the proposition of slow steaming as a standard for your company and those who you work with as well. To conclude, I would like to thank you again so very much for your precious time today and open up the floor for any questions that you may have.
Fantastic. Thank you, Live Oak Consulting team. You have given us a lot to think about, and with our hats on representing Amazon Consumer and Amazon Sustainability, I'll kick it off with two questions or two thoughts and associated questions, and then I'll invite Hal and Roberto to weigh in as well. So the first comment and question is, I guess if we're all being honest with ourselves here at Amazon, we've created a monster. We have created a monster in the sense that we are moving closer and closer to instant gratification, to a state where our consumers can make the purchase and they're expecting it within a mere number of days. I'm not sure we can ever get that reversed. I mean, if anything, it's going to faster, closer to real-time gratification, and what you're proposing is the opposite. You're proposing longer lead times, longer shipping times, slower delivery times, and that's a big challenge to an organization like Amazon. So Laura kind of touched on it, and then in the end there you also reiterated it. Yeah, there may be triple P, people, profit, planet implications, but there's also this massive implication about speed and delivery. So I like your feedback on that. So that's number one. And then number two, you're all about this slower steaming, slower shipping, and okay, I'll grant you that seems like there's some good benefits there, but the alternative to me is, why not just build bigger boats? If you look at the Ever Given case that was all over the headlines in the last couple of weeks in the Suez Canal, your example was 8,000 TEUs. I think the Ever Given carried something like 20,000 TEUs. So instead of having our boats go slower, why not just bigger boats that can go as fast as humanly possible, and in that way we'll cut down on the overall emissions as well. Your thoughts?
Yes, thank you for those great points and insights. So we do recognize that Amazon has really accelerated the pace of instant gratification and consumers' desire for that to be ordering one day and receiving it the next, or maybe even within hours if they live in a metropolitan city. But ultimately, we also believe strongly both in Amazon's fulfillment warehouse solution in having distributed warehouses across the country with all of the goods that customers could possibly desire to meet that demand. Once a customer clicks order, it's already in the fulfillment center and it's fulfilled from that point. The second point on that is Amazon has also, we understand from your internal team that you use some advanced artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions to understand what the customers are buying or what they're thinking about buying, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of days before they purchase. So that gives us pretty strong insight into how we need to approach our sourcing strategy, and ultimately can send those orders out before customers actually tell us and click the button and say, I want this mailed to my door tomorrow, or I want this mailed to my door on Saturday. So that's part one. Part two, there are larger ships, and that is a great point. We are open to those being used. 8,000 was used because it is a pretty common ship size and had accessible data around that. And also for the fact that if we are seeking to slow our ships down, having them come in more frequently would be attractive to help lower our increased inventory carrying, assuming that Amazon is taking those operations in-house. Now, if it was a carrier service or a courier service, carrying those, ultimately those benefits would be none at that point. So we would be open to larger ships on certain routes, probably not those involving the Suez Canal, given the recent example of the Ever Given.
Very good, thank you. So fellow board members, Hal and Roberto, take it away.
Okay, this is Hal Huffer. First question is let's go back to the basic marketing paradigm. I'd like you to just describe that a little more, because the basic that you're challenging is that faster is better. And so you're saying that slower is going to be a much more sustainable way of doing things. But what kind of a explanation would you give to another service, to the unions, to all the other people who are engaged in maritime shipping? How would you address that question of the paradigm that faster is better, but we're trying to present something that is slower and ethical? But how will you explain that to them if you were to go to other people that are engaged in the maritime industry, shipping industry?
I think one thing that we thought about when considering slow shipping and slow steaming as a solution for Amazon was that it has already been successfully adopted as a practice by other shipping companies. So Beijing Joyo, which is a subsidiary of Amazon, is not currently using this practice, but other more European-based shipping lines have already adopted it as the standard, and regulatory standards have been adjusted in ships coming from the EU to meet that. So I think in terms of speaking to unions and people who are working on ships, yes, it's a tough transition, but there is precedent for it, and it likely will not affect their day-to-day working conditions. In terms of the marketing paradigm, and Laura and Stephen can add on to this answer, it won't affect the direct consumer as much as Laura spoke to earlier, because the fulfillment center is really where the products are delivered from. So slow steaming is better, but slow delivery of products from the fulfillment center to the door is not necessarily better. So we think that by working at this back end of the supply chain, we can increase sustainability in terms of moving products from the factory to the fulfillment center, but we'll keep the same pace of delivery from the fulfillment center to the end destination, because Amazon's already done a great job of using electric vehicles and sustainable packaging for that aspect of their supply chain.
Very good. Thank you very much.
I have a few questions. I was hoping to start off with some just short Q&A, and then I can move into kind of a deeper space. Yeah, and you answered me one of my initial, and maybe you can elaborate. Is anyone else doing this? And you're saying that in the European space, there is some of that, but do you know of any other corporations like Amazon or near Amazon that have adopted this?
One, I'm not sure of any other corporations that have adopted it, because that data is not always publicly available. I do know that Maersk has been using this practice on and off since 1970. It actually initiated with the oil crisis as a method to use fuel more sustainably, and they've continued to use it. So it's been successful for the companies with whom Maersk works.
Okay, just because as an executive, I'd want to protect myself by having some precedent, right? And not being always the first one, though sometimes that's a good thing. But the second question is, and I know you went into the money aspect of it, but I'll ask it in a simple way. Is it cheaper for Amazon to go slower? Meaning, are the prices per container that I'm paying on that Beijing to LA trip cheaper, the same, or more expensive than what I pay now?
So I approach the financial angle of this from the aspect of building capacity to maintain the same costs that like we would normally see in the industry for that same route. But I do think that you could look at it from the angle and potentially see those costs increasing if you're working with a carrier. But ultimately, it is the carrier's benefit for them to spend less money on bunker fuel. So I ultimately believe that prices will remain about the same coming across.
So that's kind of where I wanted to get to, because I guess if Amazon owns the carrier, it's one and the same, right? If they don't own the carrier, then you're getting benefits on one end of the transaction, but not necessarily on the other end of the transaction. I did notice that you used and just to confirm, you used a Amazon-owned carrier in this example?
That's correct. So Beijing Joyo is a subsidiary. However, that is one that is relatively more recent in the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. So they work with a number of firms that have the size of Maersk around the world as well. Yeah. So Amazon has a complex logistics solution at this point, yeah, and are engaging in experimental trials of what will ultimately be their solution. Yeah.
No, I can imagine with that volume, it's they have to go source wherever the capacity exists. So to me, again, as an executive in Amazon, here's kind of what I take out of this. I think for Amazon, that extra 10% in time, say it's a 30-day voyage, and you're asking me to take 33 days by going 10% slower. I'm sure I think the math works out that way. We're talking, the question is inventory, right? And I think we can't dismiss inventory, because even a 10% increase, how much do we have in the water at any given time? $100 million. A 10% increase in that is $10 million at a month, right? And so we have to make sure that when we are considering this, that the savings that the shipping companies are experiencing are either shared with us, or if it's our company, that we're benefiting from that. And I'm not sure right now of that math. And I think that would be my one kind of concern as an executive, that I'm not really sure. Adding inventory to the pipeline is expensive, and I'm not sure if that's been addressed necessarily. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yes, so I do agree with you. We will have more inventory on boats if we choose to adopt this practice. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is focusing in on that AI lens to predict what types of materials are going to be in demand 40 days from now so that we can plan, receive those materials, and then ship them in 7 days. I think that two other things to keep in mind here: fuel prices with increased regulation in the future are expected to increase. So we would see not necessarily more savings there, but we would see a greater benefit. Not greater savings based on current day prices, but it will become a more attractive proposition to engage in slow steaming. And last point here, I think Amazon, by working with to develop their internal capacity to ship, they can actually decrease what they need to hold in inventory, because if they're going to ship, let's say, 1,000 boxes of one item, and they do that once a month, if they change that model and ship either 250 each week or 500 every 2 weeks, we can take care of that 3 extra days on the water pretty easily and have the safety stocks necessary without incurring or carrying too much additional inventory.
So I appreciate your 3 points. I think there's definitely opportunity in some of those points, and definitely room for discussion on some other ones. But I think they were valid and something we should continue to consider.
I have one more question. If there is any one company that would be impacted by this, what would it be? I mean, the biggest illustration of the challenge that you have to overcome, if you could pick a company, is there any particular one or any particular part of the industry that you're really going to have to focus on to get this accomplished?
I think that one aspect that might be the most difficult to work out in the initial phases is what Laura touched on in her description of the supply chain in terms of the bill of lading and regulatory standards. So like we were talking about earlier, Danish-based shippers have already implemented this. And in fact, there have been cases in Britain establishing that slow steaming is allowable legally according to the new standards released by the International Maritime Organization. But because for China-based shippers, this is a relatively new practice, it'll require some legal navigation to set up those contracts to allow for slow steaming and not, of course, the duty of the shipper to proceed with all due speed. So there's precedent, but of course, something to navigate there.
You've answered the question well. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Roberto, any other questions with your board member hat on?
No, I don't have any other questions with my board member.
Okay, then we will say that part 2 is done, check, and we will move into part 3. We are taking off our board member hats and we're back to being regular old humans. And now we can just give the honest exchange of ideas and information. I'll start simply by saying it is an honor to be partnering with Hal and Roberto in offering some feedback to you students, and massive kudos to you as a team, as a student team, to have put your finger on an incredible issue and set of ethical opportunities. I mean, of all the things I've heard today, this is the most timely, in my opinion. We already mentioned the Suez and Ever Given. Obviously on Netflix right now, there is a very disturbing documentary on what we as humans are doing to our oceans. So hugely important and timely. So well done. Thank you. And in that spirit, boy, some fascinating ideas and proposals. Perhaps, again, among the more realistic solutions that we've heard. There have been some wild and crazy solutions today, but I mean, you have come up with a proven strategy and said, hey, if we just expand this, we can really make a difference. So worth pursuing, worth defending. Yes, as you've heard from the three of us judges, there are some challenges. There are some alternatives. I tongue in cheek talked about, we'll just have bigger boats. That is certainly the way the world seems to be going. And there are problems with that too. If you get pushed in that direction, feel free to push back and say that every time that a major port like Miami or LA or you name it has to dredge another 2 to 5 feet to accommodate these larger and larger container ships, we continue to degrade and ruin our ecosystem as a result. So there are negative consequences there with the bigger boats. Anyway, there are always going to be alternatives.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's funny. I would never interrupt, but I wrote, don't be afraid to respectfully stand your ground, on that same spot, because so it's just funny that you were thinking the same thing. Ultimately, it's the same conundrum with regardless of the size, it's the speed, which is the issue.
Yeah. So the one other alternative that did not at all come up in our conversation, but I'll just throw it out there. Hopefully you're prepared. And that is when somebody comes back to you and says, well, why do we even have these damn global supply chains anyway? Why aren't we just producing it locally so we cut out the whole shipping disaster to begin with? And hopefully you have some ideas around that too.
Very good.
And that's it. I'll shut up and let the other judges weigh in, but thank you guys. Fabulous, fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
I was very impressed with the way it was presented. I think in the real world, this kind of a presentation would be something that would get the board talking. They would want to hear what you have to say, particularly as students, and you've come up with a lot of information and put a lot of apples and oranges together to make it work. And I think that's a very good thing. There's some things that are weak that have nothing to do with you, just the human nature of what we're dealing with and the dynamic of an economy. With a board the size of Amazon and the impact they have on our economy and so on. But the presentation that you make is quite good. It's good with numbers. I like the way you use the numbers. You use the numbers effectively. And I think that's very good. And you also do one other thing, which I found was very effective as a presentation of a team. And that is that you talked about all the various details and also admitted that there were some serious drawbacks that then you presented those drawbacks and then you would answer your own questions. And I think that was a very good way that it becomes effective. And finally, though, I think the one thing that should be brought in some place would be more about some of the other stakeholders. What would they benefit from besides Amazon itself? What would some of the stakeholders, the unions with jobs, with some of the people in the local communities, would they have increase or decrease in the implementation of this in terms of jobs, retail sales, and so on in a different area? Now that's beyond where you're at, but I think it's a very good start, and that's why I think from a standpoint of a presentation, it would be very interesting for a board member to be a real board member to give him this proposal that you have and say, hey, can we talk to some of the members of the board? This is just our idea, and get some feedback, which will be then a research paper for graduate work for you. So that'll be good. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. And something I mentioned earlier with other groups, I like the nice, clean graphics, right? I like you had like a cool theme with the circle thing, and it was clean. I really, like Hal said, appreciated the professional charts. You kind of brought in some industry publications and put them up there and talk to them. I think that always people recognize those names, and so that people react to that information. You laid the foundation extremely well in the opening slides. And you are correct, right? Even though somebody else is shipping the product or is holding it, ultimately Amazon and any other kind of global buyer that's paying for that has a responsibility and can affect change with that type of mode of transportation. So I think you laid that out very nicely, and I think you proved yourself to be valid, right? And I believed everything because of the contextual data you put out there. So I was in a good space going into kind of what you were going to tell me. I thought it was well rehearsed, and I don't mean to say that it looked rehearsed. I just thought it was well prepared and it came out naturally, and I appreciated that. Yeah. Some of the kind of on the building side, right? I don't be afraid, in my opinion, to state your solution sooner. I read your executive summary, so I kind of knew where you were going with that. But in your presentation, it wasn't until maybe a third of the way through, and I might be wrong, that you kind of came in with this. Here's what we propose. And I think when you're talking to execs and things like that, it's okay to kind of present that up front and then go through the story, right? And I think the biggest thing I would say to you is ultimately, from an Amazon standpoint, I still don't know the ethical piece. I understand, but from a financial piece, I still don't know after that presentation if it's cheaper or more expensive for me, right? And I have a feeling, right? Just it's going to be more expensive for me, and so that should be addressed, in my opinion, some way or other. That hey, the inventory situation or the cost of, because I'm thinking these vessels are having less shipments, meaning less containers are being moved per year, meaning that if they want to keep their revenue the same, they're going to have to charge more by container, right? So to me, that's still unclear, and I think there could be a little bit more clarification on that. That's all I had. But one thing I want to say is extremely well presented, extremely well organized. I could see all the work that went into it, and your solution I think is on point. I think there's Hal said something like, this is the type of thing that will make the board talk, right? They will take this idea and it needs a little work, but there's enough there where they can take it somewhere and kind of see where it works and how they can make it work. And so I think you've gained your objective at that point, which is to kind of affect change. And so I applaud you for that and for your preparation. Good job.
Thank you so much for your feedback. That is so helpful to hear.
My pleasure.